The modern world builds men like houses of cards, impressive to look at but collapsing at the first breath of real wind. The assassin came for Conan in the palace bathhouse, thinking to catch the king unarmed and vulnerable, his body relaxed by hot water and steam. The fool had been sent by the merchant council of Koth, soft men grown rich through trade, who believed gold could purchase what their own hands were too weak to take. The assassin was young, trained in the academies of Nemedia, where they taught killing as if it were dance, all elegant technique and theoretical application, divorced from the messy reality of actual violence. Conan heard him approach through the steam, the whisper of oiled leather on wet tile, the controlled breathing of someone who had been taught to manage fear rather than transcend it. The Cimmerian did not move from where he reclined in the heated pool, did not reach for the sword that hung within arm's reach on the wall. He simply waited, counting heartbeats, measuring distance by sound alone. The assassin struck with textbook precision, his blade angling down toward the king's exposed neck in a thrust that should have severed the spine at the base of the skull. But Conan was not where the young killer expected, had moved at the last instant with speed that defied his massive frame, and the blade that should have ended a life instead plunged into empty water. The Cimmerian's hand closed on the assassin's wrist like a bear trap, crushing the small bones with a sound like green wood snapping. The young man screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed off the bathhouse tiles, and tried to pull away. Conan rose from the water in a surge of muscle and violence, his free hand finding the assassin's throat, his fingers digging into the soft tissue until he felt the cartilage of the windpipe beginning to collapse. "This is what your modern training has made you," Conan said, his voice conversational despite the murder happening in his grip. "Fast and precise, and utterly useless when your pretty technique fails." He slammed the assassin's head against the tile wall, once, twice, 3 times, each impact producing a wet crack that grew progressively softer as the skull gave way. Blood and brain matter painted the decorative mosaics, steam rising from the warm gore, and the young man's body went limp in the king's hands. Conan held him there for a moment longer, studying the ruin he had made, seeing in the shattered skull all the weakness that civilization bred when it tried to create warriors through instruction rather than trial. The modern world, Conan reflected as he dropped the corpse into the bathwater, where it floated face down and twitching, raised men in safe environments where hardship was theoretical and violence was something studied from books. They learned fighting from masters who had themselves learned from books, passing down techniques that had been refined and polished until they bore no resemblance to the crude brutality of actual combat. They practiced on willing partners in controlled settings where injury was avoided and death was impossible, and they believed this preparation made them dangerous. But preparation without testing was illusion, knowledge without application was useless, and technique without the will to use it was decoration. The assassin had known 1,000 ways to kill, could probably recite the proper angle for every thrust and the optimal target for every strike. But he had never killed, never felt flesh part under his blade, or heard the rattle of a dying man's breath, never learned the difference between knowing how to do violence and actually doing it when your life depended on the outcome. Conan climbed from the bath and retrieved his sword, wiping the blade clean though it had drawn no blood this day. The palace guards would find the body eventually, would investigate and question and file reports that would gather dust in some archive. The merchant council of Koth would send another assassin, probably better trained, possibly more experienced, certainly no more successful. Because they were trying to kill him using men built by their modern methods, shaped by comfort and instruction rather than forged through hardship and survival. The Cimmerian had been built differently. His education had come from Cimmerian winters that killed the unprepared, from wolves that attacked without warning, from tribal feuds where hesitation meant death and mercy meant weakness. He had learned to fight not from masters teaching technique, but from opponents trying to kill him, had developed his skills through application rather than instruction, had earned every capability through the simple necessity of survival. This was the fundamental difference between men built by the modern world and men forged by harsh necessity. The modern world created specialists, individuals highly skilled in narrow domains, but helpless outside those domains. An assassin who could kill with elegant efficiency when everything went according to plan, but who panicked when the plan failed. A soldier who could maintain formation and follow orders, but who froze when separated from his unit. A merchant who could negotiate complex trades, but who could not defend himself when negotiations turned to violence. The harsh world created generalists, men who could adapt to any situation because they had survived situations that required every skill they possessed, and several they had to improvise on the spot. Conan could fight with sword or axe or bare hands, could survive in desert or mountain or forest, could track game or read the weather or navigate by stars. Not because he had been taught these skills in sequence by patient instructors, but because circumstances had demanded he learn them or die, and he had chosen to learn. The palace steward found Conan dressing in his chambers an hour later, the bathhouse incident already discovered and the body removed. The steward was a nervous man named Fabius, who had served 3 kings and expected to serve several more by virtue of making himself useful without becoming threatening. He wrung his soft hands and spoke in apologetic tones about the failure of palace security, about how such a breach should never have occurred, about the steps being taken to ensure it never happened again. Conan cut him off with a gesture. "Send word to the merchant council. Tell them their assassin failed because he was built to fail, trained by methods that create the illusion of capability without the reality of strength. Tell them if they want me dead, they should send a barbarian who learned to kill by killing, not a civilized boy who learned technique from books." Fabius blinked, uncertain if this was serious instruction or the king's grim humor. He stammered something about diplomatic language and appropriate messaging, and Conan's hand shot out faster than the steward could track, closing on his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult without causing actual damage. "Send. My." "Words," the Cimmerian said, releasing the steward who staggered back, gasping. The incident would be discussed in council chambers and noble halls, would be analyzed by military theorists and debated by philosophers. They would miss the point entirely, would focus on technique and training and security protocols, rather than understanding the fundamental truth the dead assassin represented. That the modern world's methods produced men who were fragile despite their polish, who shattered when tested because they had never been tested in ways that mattered. Conan had seen this pattern repeat across kingdoms and through generations. Each civilization grew more sophisticated in its training methods, more elaborate in its educational systems, more confident in its ability to create capable men through instruction. And each generation of men produced by these systems grew weaker, more specialized, more dependent on the structures that supported them. The inevitable result was collapse when those structures failed, when war or plague or economic disaster stripped away the comfortable circumstances that modern training assumed. The specialists found themselves helpless outside their narrow domains. The theorists discovered their knowledge was useless without the strength to apply it. The trained warriors learned that technique without testing was just choreography. And in the ruins of collapsed civilizations, barbarians would endure, would adapt, would rebuild according to older and harsher principles. Not because barbarians were superior in some abstract sense, but because they had been forged by methods that actually tested capability, that killed the weak and strengthened the survivors, that created men who could function in any circumstance because they had survived circumstances that would have broken the modern world's carefully constructed specialists. Conan looked out from his palace window at the city of Tarantia spread below, saw the citizens going about their comfortable lives, the artisans and merchants and scholars who believed their civilization would endure forever. He knew better. He had seen too many cities fall, too many kingdoms crumble, too many civilizations collapse under their own accumulated weakness. And he understood that the modern methods these people trusted to build capable men were in fact building nothing but elaborate failures waiting for the test that would reveal their fundamental inadequacy. The warning was written in the dead assassin's broken skull, in the ease with which Conan had killed a man supposedly trained to kill. But warnings went unheeded when they contradicted comfortable beliefs, and the modern world would continue building its fragile men until the day came when fragility meant extinction and all their sophisticated training proved worthless against opponents forged by harsher schools.